So I want to continue our discussion of the MIDI specification now by picking up on this challenge that we were talking about towards the end of the last video about the need for different devices to agree on what MIDI messages mean in specific. And this was kind of most pronounced in this question of MIDI program changes. And making sure that when one device sends out a MIDI program change, that the other device actually interprets it as meaning the same thing, as a request to load the same type of instrument sound. So we're going to start this video by talking about general MIDI, which was a direct attempt to address that problem, as well as a couple others. And then we'll talk about standard MIDI files later on. So I want to get into general MIDI. This was developed in 1991, so it was not part of the original MIDI specification in 1983, but it was really trying to address these challenges that were coming up in the real world use of MIDI. And so what it was a standardized set of specifications for sound modules. They had to support a certain polyphony, so to be able to play back a certain number of notes at the same time. They needed to be able to respond on all 16 channels simultaneously, and to be able to load a different sound on each one. These are both things that pretty much any sound module today would do, but in 1991, not every sound module did support these two things. And then the most important thing here is that they needed to support a standard set of program changes, so that they would agree on what each of those 128 program changes actually meant. There were some other parts of the general MIDI specification, but these were the three most critical ones. The other thing that's really important to note here is that this was not required that devices implement it. Manufacturers could choose whether to implement general MIDI or not. But if they did implement general MIDI, they would get a special sticker they could put on their device that would basically say general MIDI, so that people would know that it supported these standards and that they could use it for this purpose. And the real point of this was that if you were if you were composing music in a MIDI sequencer and you wanted to be able to share that with other people that might not have the same sound modules that you had, you could write it for general MIDI, for that expectation about support for 16 channels, a certain number of simultaneous notes you can play across those 16 channels, and these particular 128 sounds. And then as long as someone had a general MIDI device to play back your MIDI sequence on, it would sound more or less the same as the way you had intended it to sound. And in fact, nowadays we have general MIDI synthesizers embedded in our operating systems on Macintosh and Windows. If you go into your web browser and you load up a MIDI file from some website, it's going to play back using a general MIDI synthesizer because it's built into Mac OS and it's built into Windows. It's in fact built into most cell phones these days as well too. So I'm not going to show you all 128 of these sounds, but I just want to give you a taste of the different kinds of sounds that are out there. So program 1 is a grand piano, program 12 is a vibraphone. We get strings like violins, choir sounds, saxophone. But then as you get higher up towards 128, the sounds get more and more obscure and a little bit more esoteric. So for instance, 78 is a shakuhachi. 97 is the sound of a rainstorm. 115 are steel drums, and 126 is a helicopter. And there's other kind of seemingly random things like a helicopter that are thrown in there as well. But the point is, these are the 128 sounds that are supported. Now, general MIDI doesn't go beyond naming these sounds in the specification. It doesn't say how you should make these sounds, or specifically, what a vibraphone should sound like, or what a helicopter should sound like, or anything like that. So there's still a decent amount of variation amongst general MIDI synthesizers and sound modules, particularly in terms of sound quality. But at least they all agree on what they're trying to represent. Beyond these 128 sounds, there's one other convention, which is that channel 10 is reserved for percussion, and that when you're on channel 10, each MIDI note number corresponds to a particular percussion sound. So MIDI note number 35 would be a bass drum, 38 would be a snare drum, and so on and so forth. This is, again, not all of the sounds here. I just want to show you a sampling and the different types of percussion sounds and the mappings that are here. So general MIDI was incredibly powerful in terms of enabling people to compose on one MIDI setup, one sound module or set of sound modules, and then share that with other people that could play it back under very different circumstances. But general MIDI needed to be combined with something else to really have that, that portability of sharing music with other people. Because it's not just about the MIDI program changes and these specs, it's also about how am I sharing that MIDI sequence, that song that I wrote, with other people. And that's where standard MIDI files come in. And this was actually part of the original MIDI specification. And it's essentially a standard format for sequencers to use to encode MIDI data, to be able to save it as a file on disk that you can then share with other people. They can load into a sequencer. Pretty much every MIDI sequencer and every DAW supports importing and exporting of these standard MIDI files. And the representation is very straightforward. It's exactly what you would imagine. It's different tracks which correspond to different channels typically. And on each of those channels we have a set of MIDI messages. And those MIDI messages have timestamps associated with them. So then we can load in these MIDI messages and the timestamps, and we can play them back. Or we can display them and import them into a view on our sequencer. These MIDI messages, these MIDI standard MIDI files, like MIDI itself, have an extremely compact file size because it's just storing MIDI messages. It's not storing any audio data. So an entire song might be 5 kilobytes or 10 kilobytes instead of megabytes and megabytes of audio data, of waveforms. And so the combination of these standard MIDI files that were extremely portable with general MIDI, this way of standardizing how MIDI messages should be answered in terms of program changes and polyphony and 16 channels of support and so on, led to a proliferation of sharing and playing of standard MIDI files across a range of general MIDI devices. And one of the ones that became most widespread was cell phones, and particularly ringtones for cell phones were long distributed as standard MIDI files, and cell phones long had and still have general MIDI synthesizers that will play back those standard MIDI files. And nowadays we may use MP3s a lot more than we use MIDI files for our ringtones. But I just want to play you an example of this because kind of the sound of this general MIDI kind of cheesy MIDI ringtone, I think, defined an era of cell phones and how we used ringtones. And that particular ringtone comes courtesy of my friend and colleague Phil Burke, who actually had a company, Mobilier, which developed ringtone engines for a number of cell phones in the early 2000s. So what we've covered about the MIDI specification in this video, in the last one, was MIDI channels and ports, why they exist, and some applications of them in sequencing and talking to a number of different sound modules or a number of voices on the same one. Different types of MIDI messages, MIDI note on and off messages, MIDI control change messages, pitch bend messages, program change messages. General MIDI, what it is, and why it exists, and kind of the motivations for adding it to the MIDI specification in 1991. And then these standard MIDI files, and how they can combine with general MIDI to create some interesting applications for MIDI, like cell phone ringtones, and also how they work as a general interchange format between different DAW software and different MIDI sequencer software. What we're going to cover in the rest of this module now is going back to Reaper, going back to the DAW, and starting to actually do some MIDI sequencing, and look at how to record and edit and manipulate MIDI data in the DAW.